what I wanted to do is give you an idea of how these projects evolve. And so you'll see some background material, you'll see the kinds of things that I work with at the beginning of a project and where those materials lead to. So, or if you could just bring the lights down. I usually like to start my programs with a few paintings just to give you an idea of what I do. This is a Dutch house, a Dutch farmstead that was built on the Papskenny Creek, about 6 miles south of Albany. This is an Iroquois longhouse community, a Mohawk community on the banks of the Mohawk River near Canajoharie, New York. I worked with Dean Snow on this project, who is an anthropologist at SUNY Albany. And this is a painting of the entrance of what they call the Little River. The Hudson River is sort of out in the background, out here. The man who owned this vessel was Eric Van Curler, and Van Curler had a farmstead and lived among the Mohawks. These are Mohawk warriors coming out to investigate his cargo, which was horses, which was very rare for them to see. This is a phenomenal map. One of the documentarians of the late 17th and early 18th century was a British engineer named Wolfgang Romer. And Romer made some terrific maps. You're going to see a few of them this evening. But this is a map that he made around 1700 of western New York. This is where Albany is today. This is the area where Syracuse is. And he traveled west along the Mohawk River, and he made some really interesting notes. So if you look at details of the map, he not only does these little sketches of the Onondaga communities that he came across, but he also indicates the trails that he followed, including this wonderful little trip by canoe up the Seneca River. So we have, there's a great deal of information here. One of the things that I thought was particularly helpful is this little cartouche that he made on the map of Indian houses. Now he's seeing this in 1700. So what you're starting to notice in the architecture, look at this little shed. It's almost European in design. And the roofs, although the longhouses still have this sort of arch shape, some of them are starting to show a much more European style pitch, including a little hip in that roof. So this is particularly helpful because he saw this stuff and he recorded it. I did a project with Greg Sorwhiding and Jim Bradley about 10 years ago. They had been doing archaeology of an Indian site in that part of western New York, and they'd come across a community, an Onondaga community, and they had excavated a number of areas on the site, and they had found the post molds of a house and some kind of storage shed alongside the house. They had done some speculative locations and trying to determine the angles of the post molds that they were finding. And so I used that data and then digitally developed the idea of what this structure may have looked like. This is part of a digital model. This is the digital model sort of filling in. Now, with Greg's project, I only took this as far as drawings. I never really got to a painting stage, but from this information, I made that drawing. This was an incredible discovery on, well, not discovery, rediscovery on their part. The Algonquian people fished using weirs, which are fish traps that they would build across a river or a stream. And this is a very, very early John White watercolor that shows an Indian weir. Now this is before 1600. This is down in the area of Virginia. But these are Algonquian people, the same Algonquian people that are living all throughout the whole Hudson Valley.
You mean before 1700?
Before, oh yeah, that was 1580 something. But one of the fascinating facets of life among the Onondaga in western New York was discovered by a guy named William Beauchamp. And this is a section of the Seneca River near Baldwinville, New York, which is north and west of Syracuse. On this bend in the river, Beauchamp had seen, he saw this in 1870. He saw a structure in the river, a stone structure, not a wooden structure, a stone structure, not unlike a Roman fish weir, over 800 feet in length. And the remarkable thing about that is there are still remnants of this that can be seen today. You can still see the shadow of what Beauchamp saw in the 1870s. It was a structure that looked something like this. And for a book that they were doing on the Onondaga, I made some sketches of what that might have looked like. But I think it's remarkable to think about American native people in North America, in New York State, building stone structures. This is a painting that I made also for Jim Bradley. This is based on the research of Karen Hartkin and Lucianne Lavin of a community south of Albany, also on the Tuscany Creek. To remember, the first slide that I showed was a Dutch house very near this site. This is a wigwam and then two lean-tos and what came to be called the Three Sisters, the crops they planted: beans, corn, and squash. So some of the projects start with maps, and I was hired by the New York State Department of Parks and Recreation, their Historic Sites Bureau. They were redoing the exhibition area at the Senate House in Kingston, and they wanted me to do research and develop an image of what Kingston may have looked like in the 17th century. Everybody knows what Kingston looks like later on. The stone houses are still there around the city, but this is long before that period. So this is a map of Albany that was drawn by a minister named John Miller. This was drawn around 1695. And it's kind of a crude map. It shows where Broadway in Albany is today. This would be State Street in Albany. This is where the New York State Capitol building is, and the Hudson River is out here. Miller was, he wasn't really a trained cartographer. When I showed you the first map that Wolfgang Romer made this beautiful map of Albany around the same time, about 1695. And on Romer's map, you can see here's the Hudson River, but he also shows very detailed things like the streams that came through the city. He's very careful about locating the stockade around the city. This is where Broadway in Albany is today, State Street. The fort is very nicely detailed at there at the top of the hill. He was military trained, he was a colonel, and he carefully measured things. He had tools to establish exactly where things are. This map is so accurate that you can take it and place it on Albany today and the streets line up.
Wow.
So we have these two examples by two different cartographers around the same time. We have Miller with this crude rendition of Albany and its streets, and we have Romer with this very, very detailed and accurate map of Albany at the same time. There are some interesting similarities. Even though Miller doesn't have the skills that Romer has, if you look at the Miller fort, he's very specifically indicating that the bastions are pointed on 3 corners and that one of the bastions is round. And you can see that same detail here on Romer. 3 pointed bastions and one of the bastions on the corner is round. So Miller isn't way off. He's just not as technically accurate. Well, the problem with Kingston is that there are maps of Kingston, but they're all later maps. This is a map of Kingston that was drawn in 1777. The area that very early on in Kingston's history was the stockade is in here. This is the road that goes out to Hurley. The road to New Paltz is down there. And this pond is a feature that came about in the era of the Dutch. This creek was dammed up with to operate a mill and produce this that pond. So that's the area of the early Kingston stockade. The way Kingston got started was sort of interesting. Back in the mid-1600s, there was a Dutch settlement in Albany and there was a Dutch settlement in New York City. And very, very little going on in between. There was a merchant in Albany named Thomas Chambers, and he was sort of adventurous. So on these trips that he was making up and down the Hudson River, he would occasionally anchor and go ashore and investigate, see what the Indians were doing, just see what the land was like. And he did that in Kingston. And he made his way up from the Hudson River to the Esopus Creek, and he noticed that the Indians were growing, very effectively growing corn all around the creek. And he wanted to see if he could be able to kind of participate in that. So he sort of, and I say sort of because nobody really knows how this happened, purchased some land from the Esopus Indians. They gave him an area to farm, and after 2 or 3 seasons, he was doing really well. And his competitors in Albany started to notice that he was doing well, and they wanted to get in on the action. So before long, a much larger group of settlers comes down, and they also purchase land from the Esopus so that they also can grow corn. Well, after 2 or 3 years, the Indians are scratching their head and saying, what's going on? You said you wanted to grow corn, you've been here growing corn, we let you grow corn, now it's time to go. And they said, no, you don't get it. We don't go. We bought the land from you. It belongs to us. Well, the Indians had no concept that they had given the land up, that it wasn't theirs anymore. And this becomes the beginning of the Esopus Wars. So the settlers now have a problem. Their livestock is being killed, their barns are being burned, they can't protect themselves. New York is a very well-established community by that time. Peter Stuyvesant is running it. They petition Peter Stuyvesant. They say, you have to send us some soldiers. You have to protect us. They're going to start killing us. And Stuyvesant says, there's no way that I'm going to send soldiers to this community that you have with farms and barns located, scattered over this large area. If you are willing to take your houses down and consolidate them, I will build a stockade and I will provide you with some protection. So that's what they do. In 1658, they build a stockade. They take their barns and their houses down and they move them into the stockade. Now the stockade didn't completely protect them, but it offered a bit more protection. So this is the time period, a little bit after this, so it's around 1690, that I was trying to portray. The way Dutch built their houses here were pretty much the way they built their houses in the Netherlands. This is a digital model that I built of a basic H-frame Dutch structure. We'll start with heavy timber, It would be clad with saplings, infilled with clay and reeds, and then covered with thatch. This would be a very, very basic building. So early on in the history of New York City, Albany, and Kingston, the very earliest buildings would be something like that. So the problem when you try to depict Kingston at that time is that that wonderful, accurate survey done by Romer doesn't exist for Kingston. The only map of Kingston in that time period was done by John Miller. And you can see it's pretty crude, pretty straight. The houses are little boxes. He's showing gardens inside the blocks, and he's laying the streets of Kingston out. This is his Miller's 1695 map of Kingston. This was redrawn in the 1900s with labels on the streets. But in the redrawing of it, some of the details from the earlier one were left out. So what I had to work with was that. So what is this? What does this drawing represent? What is the real look of Kingston in the 1600s? Well, the first thing that I wanted to do was take a hard look at the street pattern of Kingston. Kingston hasn't changed all that much over all this time. Some of those streets in the heart of the town are still the same. This is a tax map of that part of Kingston near the Esopus Creek, and you can see the layout of all the lots. Now, this came in handy, and I'll show you in a minute how important that turned out to be. And then I just took the number of houses that Miller is showing on his map, and I just placed them on the actual layout of the streets of Kingston. Then I plotted in the streams from the 1777 map, put in the Esopus Creek. I worked on the terrain. The mill feature here was interesting because it's written about in the documents. And it's just, the mill is described. And most interestingly, I think, is that it mentions that the mill is also a bridge. You can see that they're moving straw and rubbish carted across the mill dam. So I don't know exactly what that mill dam looks like, but there are examples of dams that are similar to that. So I think it's probably a bit more elaborate than this, but something like this. The only remaining structure in Kingston from that time period is this building, which just sits what would be just outside of that stockade of that time. But this is the only relic of that time. This is a 1770s church that was in Kingston. The problem is, this is not the first church. This is the second church in Kingston. So what was that first church like? What was the church in the Dutch era like? Well, I was working with a historian at the New York State Parks and Rec office, and he showed me this passage where it was described physically. The size of it, 45 feet by 60 feet, highly finished, windows of stained glass. He felt that this description was very much like the church that was built in Albany around the same time. So he said, study the church in Albany and see if you can find similarities. Well, so I go back to the Romer map of Albany. That's the Dutch church in Albany. And the interesting thing about Romer's depiction of that church is that he shows the hip roof. And he shows a little cupola in the middle of the roof. This church is also depicted later in drawings, so we really know what the shape of this one looks like. So when you measure it using the scale from the Romer map, it comes out to be about 40 by 50. The Kingston Church is 45 by 60, it's very similar. So if the Kingston Church was built on the same pattern as the Albany Church, its contemporary, it would have looked like that. which is not unlike the church that's here on Huguenot Street. So back to the Miller map. And if you remember, I was saying that Miller and Romer, their depictions of the Albany fort were very similar, which made me think that maybe not all of what Miller is doing is as primitive as I thought when I started. That block is fascinating, this block in Kingston. So just taking this as an isolated example, that's the block as it is right now in Kingston today. This is the tax map laid on that block. These are the parcels that are paying taxes in that little triangulated space. I took the houses that are indicated on the Miller map and plotted them in that shape. Look at that. Isn't that wild? I mean, from all those years later, the parcels haven't changed hardly at all from the Miller map. Another curiosity about the Miller map is, I mentioned that it had been redrawn in the 20th century. The buildings themselves, the hatching isn't the same. Some of the buildings have hatching that's parallel with the street, and some of the buildings have hatching that's perpendicular to the street. And I think Miller may be trying to indicate, in a kind of a graphic way, which way the roof pitches go, whether the pitch is parallel with the street or perpendicular to the street. So that was something that I tried to work into the idea. This is a later map of Kingston. This is the property that the Senate House is on. This is actually the house of one of the Tenbrook family. This is the building that becomes the Senate House. And this is that parcel, a survey of that parcel. 1687 is the date. The problem with it is that it's not drawn very accurately. The numbers are accurate, but the drawing itself isn't. So I took the shape and I drew it accurately and so that it would close and all the dimensions would match. I kept the line of the street the same on both of them. This is the developing digital model of that corner of Kingston. This is where the Senate House is today. But if you take that shape that came from that early survey and you lay it on that site today, it matches really well. It even includes the alleyway there. So, and the Senate House is almost exactly in the right spot. So what does the Senate House look like? This is a plan of the Senate House as it is today. The original building was very small. It occupied this space here. And originally I thought it was just sort of like a typical Dutch house, steep roof, simple window arrangement, door facing the street. I could not figure out what that cartouche meant on the map. It's just so peculiar. So I assumed maybe it was a wooden building. So this is the digital model that I built of the building. And then after I finished this, I met with Lois Huey. Paul Huey is an archaeologist. Lois is his wife. She's also an archaeologist. And Lois had done a dig at the Senate House some years ago, and she discovered this mass of red brick at the back of the house. Not so much on the sides, but at the back of the house. She couldn't dig in front of the house because that's where the street is. But the Dutch built a number of buildings that had masonry on the ends and wooden infill in between. The buildings in Albany are very much like that. So could that shape represent that style of Dutch house?
Yeah.
It may, and if it did, then that house would look more like that. So this is what I think the original Senate House structure started out looking like. This is the digital model, kind of getting near the end point. You can see the mill pond here. The mill is located out here. This is Front Street. And this is the model sort of filled in. And this became the basis for the area, the bird's eye view that I did of Kingston for the Senate House. Now that painting is on exhibit in Kingston if you're curious, you want to see it, but that's the painting.
Wow.
That's the mill.
Oh.
There's the church. Yeah. And I also did a couple of other paintings, smaller ones that are also in Kingston. I did this one of the Senate House building, and I did this one as if you were approaching from Hurley. So you can see that Kingston is quite a town. It's got this substantial structure around it. So it isn't just a little four corners. It's really that map, that crude map that was drawn by Romer is really representing the community. So another example of where projects start, this was an interesting one. I did this a couple of years ago for the Albany Institute of History and Art. There was a collector in England who had found this unusual artifact, the transom of some sort of vessel. And he was trying to get museums in England interested in purchasing this. And he was told by a number of historians, this has more to do with New York State than it does to do with England. So you should start looking there for a possible museum that might be interested in America. So what is this? What does it represent? The first provincial governor of New York State was a guy named George Clinton. Now, for those of you who know New York State history, the first governor of New York State was named George Clinton. They're not the same guy. This guy was the Lord of Lincolnshire. He was a British royal who was given the task of governing the province of New York, which was quite immense. I mean, it wasn't just where New York is today. It sort of extended into New Jersey and down toward Delaware. But this is the family crest of the Clinton family of Lincolnshire. You can see the two greyhounds, and there's two stars in here, and there's a number of crosses. There's a slogan in Latin, in a scroll under it, and this is the coat of arms of that family. That's what this carving represents. That object belonged to that family and was somehow involved in the life of George Clinton. Well, we know that Clinton in the 1740s, the late 1740s, the English realized that the French were encroaching on their territory. The French were in Canada. They were making their way down. There were a number of conflicts that take place on Lake Champlain and Lake George. And so they realized that there's a war coming. And it was going to be important to make allies out of the Indian groups that lived around the area. So Clinton decided that he would come to Albany and he would meet with the chiefs of the Iroquois Nation and he would give them gifts and he would see if he could create a liaison between those groups. This is a bill of sale for the trip that he made to Albany with those Indian gifts. And it's really neat to read this. To freight 19 bales of dry goods from New York to Albany, being part of the presents designed for the 6 nations of Indians. And he was charged for all of this stuff by the owner of the sloop that was going to tow his boatload of gifts north up the Hudson River. So we see here he's talking about the trip, and here he's talking about, this is now Abraham Dow, who was the owner of the vessel that's going to be doing the towing, and he's charging for everything. Repainting his boat, he wants to buy new flags. This is what the flags cost. He really wanted to deck this vessel out so that it would look like, it would be very impressive, making its way up the Hudson. The interesting thing is, this is the bill that Dow presented to the governor to be reimbursed. This is the bill that the governor presented to the Crown in England to be reimbursed for the trip. He talks about his trip to Albany, and that he was going to Albany with sloops, plural, sloops. This bill is 10 times greater than what he was charged. This is a painting in the collection of the Albany Institute of History and Art, and it's of a nobleman in Albany of the 1700s. But what I like about the painting is that in the background is this detail of a sloop towing a little vessel. Now this is exactly contemporary with this trip that Clinton is making north. So that vessel really influenced me a lot in the vessel that I was using in my painting. So what is this part of? What kind of vessel is this? And it puzzled me for a while. I did some research. I found this wonderful model. This is a model that was built in the 1740s. It's in the National Maritime Museum in England, but it has tremendous similarities to that artifact. So with that as a model, I have a set of plans that I can work from, and I built a simple digital model of that, and then I just started to kind of fill it in to be like the vessel that I found in the collection of the Maritime Museum. That was how I painted it.
Nice.
That's the vessel towing it, and that's the full painting with Albany in the background. The background scene, the Albany scene, was made pretty much the way I did the Kingston scene, using a period map, building a digital model of it, and that was how I got the layout for the city. Projects that I've done very similar to that. This is Fort Orange, using maps of the time, archaeology from the time, the Romer map, particularly the detail that he shows of the old Dutch fort, where he gives the dimensions of it, and then working with similar Dutch designs in other parts of the world, and with the archaeology that was done by Paul Huguenot in 1970. I've painted this subject, I think, 14 times in the last 20 years. People keep saying, well, you don't really know what it looks like if you've done it that many times, and the truth is, I don't. So every time I learn a little bit more about it, it gets readjusted. But the most recent painting is this one. And this painting was commissioned by the governor of New York when the Dutch royal family came to visit in 2009, and it was given to them as a gift.
Oh my goodness.
This is Manhattan in the 1660s. This is a great piece of information. This is the Costello Plan. It was a map drawn by a Belgian cartographer named Jacques Costello, and in it there's all kinds of details of the buildings, the forts. This is, you see this, that there's a wall built through there, that's Wall Street. This is the tip of Manhattan. This has all been filled in, and it's, it's quite different today. This is the digital model based on the Costello Plan, and then this was a model that I used to create that painting. This is the waterfront in Manhattan and the painting that I made from that. And this is Hanover Square in Manhattan. This is Brooklyn here in the background. And I was commissioned by the Minneapolis Marine Art Museum to do a painting for an exhibition that they have going on. They are now called New York. They wanted a 17th century painting of New York. So the painting that I did was an aerial view as if you were positioned in the East River, approximately where the Brooklyn Bridge is today, looking toward the tip of Manhattan. That's that painting. We're just looking at is up. So this painting belongs to that museum, and it's in their collection now. And this is the last painting. This is Manhattan, the tip of Manhattan in the 1660s, and that's my program.